Before we start, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. She did it on autopilot. Didn't even think about it anymore. It was like brushing her teeth or tying her shoes. A simple movement, repeated so many times it had become invisible even to herself. Every morning, before her real day began, she would stop for a few seconds, sometimes less than a minute. She'd reach into her bag, extend her hand, and continue on her way. There was no long conversation, no questions, no curiosity. The man would accept with a slight nod, sometimes a thank you, too quiet to be heard by those rushing past. Sometimes, nothing at all, and that was fine. She didn't do it expecting anything in return. She did it because at some point in her life, someone had done something similar for her, and that had stayed with her like a silent debt to the world. She was single, lived alone, carried long days and short nights. No audience, no one waiting for news at the end of the day. Maybe that's why this small gesture was so important. It was the only part of her morning that felt human. The rest of the world passed by without seeing, and she had never really stopped to look either. Until that day, the morning air hit her face with its usual crispness as she stepped out of her building at 7:43 a.m. The city was already in motion. Suits rushing towards subway entrances, delivery trucks double-parked with hazards blinking, the smell of coffee and exhaust mixing in that particular urban cologne she'd grown used to over the years. She clutched her worn canvas bag closer to her side, the strap digging into her shoulder with familiar pressure. Inside, a water bottle she'd refilled 4 times yesterday, a lunch she'd packed the night before, a paperback novel with a cracked spine she'd been reading on the train for 3 weeks, and her wallet, thin, practical, holding exactly 2 credit cards, her ID, and whatever cash she allowed herself to carry. Today, it was a $5 bill and some change. Her routine was precise not because she was naturally organized, but because she had to be. When you live alone in a city that never stops charging you for existing, precision becomes survival. She knew exactly how many subway rides she had left on her card. She knew which bodega sold day-old bread at half price after 8 p.m. She knew that if she skipped her morning coffee from the cart, the one luxury she usually allowed herself, she could put that $2.50 towards something that mattered more, like the $5 bill in her wallet. The corner where she saw him was unremarkable. A narrow stretch of sidewalk between a closed jewelry store with security gates still down and a 24-hour laundromat that always seemed empty despite its hours. There was a slight alcove there, just enough for someone to sit without completely blocking foot traffic. He was there as he had been for the past 4 months. She didn't know when it had started exactly. One day he just was, and the next day he was still there, and the day after that, until it became part of the landscape of her morning, as fixed as the crooked "Don't Walk" sign that never quite synced with the actual traffic pattern. He sat on a flattened cardboard box, his back against the jewelry store's gate. Not young, not old. Somewhere in that undefined middle space where life could have gone either direction. His clothes were worn but not filthy, his face weathered but not broken. He had a quiet dignity about him, a stillness that set him apart from the usual desperation she'd learned to recognize in the city. He never called out, never rattled a cup, never held a sign. He just sat there, existing in a way that most people had learned not to see. But she saw him. That first time, 4 months ago, she'd almost walked past. Her hand had gone into her bag out of habit, feeling for the small bills she kept separate from the rest. Her grandmother had taught her that. Always keep some singles separate, easy to reach for moments like this. For when you see someone who needs it more, her grandmother had said, and you'll know when you see them. Your heart will tell you. Her heart had told her that morning. She'd stopped, pulled out $3, and held it out. He'd looked up, surprise flickering across his face, not at the money but at the directness of it. No pity in her eyes, no performance, just a hand extended, waiting. He'd taken it with a nod. She'd continued walking, and the next day she'd done it again, and the next. It became part of her morning rhythm. Wake up at 6:30, shower, dress in one of her 4 work outfits, rotated carefully to avoid too much repetition. Make coffee she'd drink half of before it got cold. Pack her lunch, check her bag, leave at 7:40, walk 3 blocks, stop at the corner, extend her hand, continue to the subway. Some days it was $5, some days $3. Once, after a particularly good week when she'd picked up an extra shift, it was $10. On her worst days, it was whatever change she had. She never thought about it as charity. That word felt too heavy, too loaded with imbalance. This felt more like recognition, an acknowledgement that he was there, that he was real, that his existence mattered in the great, indifferent machinery of the city. The other commuters flowed around them both like water around stones. Nobody else stopped. Nobody else looked. In their defense, most were trapped in their own survival, their own calculations of rent and bills and whether they could afford lunch out today or needed to make the packed sandwich last. She understood. She lived in the same equation. But she also understood something else, that $5 meant something different depending on where you were standing. For some people on this sidewalk, $5 was a rounding error. For her, it was a conscious choice. For him, it might be the difference between eating and not eating. So she chose, every morning, without fanfare, without expecting anything to change. 4 months became a strange kind of relationship. Not friendship. They'd never exchanged names, never had a real conversation beyond those brief moments. But something existed between them, a mutual recognition, a small anchor point in both their days. She began to notice things about him. The way he always folded his cardboard carefully before sitting on it, like he was trying to make it last. The way his shoes, though worn, were always tied properly. The way he kept a small backpack next to him, weathered and faded but zipped shut, protecting whatever he valued most. She wondered about his story sometimes. During her lunch breaks at work, sitting in the small, windowless room they called the break room, eating her sandwich while her co-workers went out to restaurants she couldn't afford, she'd find her mind drifting to him. What had happened? Where had he come from? Did he have family? What did he do with the money she gave him? But she never asked, because she understood, instinctively, that some things were more valuable than answers. Privacy, dignity, the right to exist without having to explain yourself. So she kept giving, and he kept accepting, and the city kept spinning around them both. Her own life was small but stable. She worked as an administrative assistant at a mid-size insurance company, the kind of place where the carpet was industrial gray, and the fluorescent lights hummed with a frequency that gave her headaches by 3 p.m. The pay was barely enough, but it was steady. Health insurance. 2 weeks vacation she never took because she couldn't afford to go anywhere. Her apartment was a studio in a neighborhood that had once been up and coming, but had stalled somewhere in the middle of its transformation. Small, but hers. A twin bed, a kitchenette, a bathroom where the shower pressure was more of a suggestion than a reality. A window that looked out onto an air shaft, but at least it let in some light. She'd made it work. Plants she'd propagated from cuttings shared by a co-worker. Shelves made from boards and bricks. A quilt her grandmother had made before she passed. Everything in her space was either functional or meaningful. There was no room for anything else. At night, she'd heat up soup or make pasta, sit on her bed with her plate balanced on her lap, and read. Sometimes she'd call her sister upstate, listen to stories about her nieces, feel both happy and hollow at the same time. Sometimes she'd just sit in the quiet, listening to the building settle around her. She wasn't unhappy, but she wasn't quite happy either. She existed in that middle space where most people live, not suffering, not thriving, just continuing, making it work, getting by, hoping that someday getting by might evolve into something more. The morning gesture was the one thing she did that felt like more, like she was participating in something beyond her own survival, like she mattered in some small way to someone else's story. She didn't know how right she was about that. The morning that changed everything started like any other. Actually, that's not quite true. It started worse. She'd slept through her alarm, a rare occurrence that left her scrambling, anxious, behind schedule. The shower was cold because her building's ancient water heater was acting up again. She couldn't find her left shoe and wasted precious minutes searching before discovering it under the bed, where she'd apparently kicked it in her sleep. Her phone was buzzing with messages from her boss about a project that had somehow become urgent overnight, despite being low priority for weeks. The kind of manufactured emergency that made her teeth clench. She grabbed her bag, didn't bother with breakfast, and rushed out the door at 7:52, 12 minutes later than usual. The city felt more aggressive that morning. Someone's garbage had spilled onto the sidewalk, forcing her to walk in the street for half a block. A taxi honked at her. The air smelled like hot asphalt and something rotting. When she reached the corner, she was genuinely tempted to keep walking. She was late. She was stressed. She hadn't had coffee. Her boss was already sending follow-up messages asking where she was. What difference would one morning make? He probably wouldn't even notice. But her feet stopped anyway. Habit stronger than intention. She reached into her bag, feeling for her wallet with fingers that trembled slightly from too much adrenaline and not enough caffeine. She pulled out a $5 bill, the only cash she had, and held it out. But he didn't take it immediately. She looked up, confused. He was staring at her. Not at the money, at her. Really looking at her for the first time in 4 months. His eyes were clearer than she'd realized. A deep brown that held something she couldn't quite name. Not gratitude, not pity. Something more like recognition. You know you don't have to do this every day, right? His voice was quiet but clear, educated. Not what she'd expected, though she realized immediately how unfair that expectation was. She blinked, thrown off balance. They'd never had a real conversation. She didn't know how to respond. "I know," she said finally, still holding out the bill. He didn't take it. Instead, he looked down at her hand, then back up at her face. He took a breath, deep, heavy, like he'd been holding something in for a long time, and was finally deciding to let it out. Nobody's ever done this for me for so long. Without asking anything, without needing to know why. She felt heat rising in her cheeks. This was too much, too real. Her whole body wanted to retreat back into the comfortable anonymity of their previous arrangement. "It doesn't cost anything," she said, forcing a smile, trying to lighten the moment. That's when he said it, quietly, firmly, with absolute certainty. "It's cost you more than you think." She frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" He gestured toward her bag, the worn canvas with a strap that was fraying at one end. Then toward her shoes, practical flats that had been resoled twice already. Then to her wrist, where her watch sat, a basic digital model she'd bought at a drugstore 3 years ago. "I've been paying attention for a while now. You're not someone who has extra. You're someone who divides what you have." The words hit her like cold water. Because he was right. Completely, undeniably right. And because nobody had ever noticed before. The silence stretched between them. Around them, the city continued its morning symphony. Car horns, footsteps, the beeping of a truck backing up somewhere, the distant wail of a siren. But in that small alcove, everything had gone quiet. She wanted to laugh it off, wanted to say something dismissive and move on, restore the comfortable boundary between them. But her throat felt tight, and she realized with uncomfortable clarity that she was close to crying. When had anyone last really seen her? Not just looked at her while taking her lunch order, or nodded at her in the hallway at work, or said, "Excuse me," while pushing past her on the subway. When had anyone actually seen her? Noticed her? Paid attention to the details of her life with enough care to understand what they meant? She thought about her co-workers, who invited her to lunch sometimes but never pushed when she declined. About her sister, who loved her but was absorbed in her own full life upstate with her husband and kids. About the neighbors she'd smile at in the hallway, but never quite connected with. She was visible, but unseen. Present, but unnoticed. Except to this man sitting on cardboard, who apparently had been watching more carefully than anyone else in her life. She didn't know what to say. The $5 bill was still in her extended hand, now feeling awkward, inappropriate somehow. He reached up slowly and took it, folded it carefully and tucked it into his jacket pocket. "Can I tell you something?" he asked. "Just today, if you want to hear it." She should have said no. She was already late. Her boss was probably furious. The day was piling up with problems, and standing here having an intimate conversation with someone whose name she didn't even know was not going to help. But she nodded anyway. "I'm not who you think I am," he said simply. She felt herself tense, uncertain where this was going. Was he dangerous? Had she been naive? 4 months of trust suddenly felt foolish. He must have seen something in her face because he quickly shook his head. "I'm not trying to scare you, I'm not here because I have nowhere else to go. I'm not homeless. Well, I am right now, technically, but it's by choice." She stared at him, trying to process this. "I had a life," he continued, his voice steady, matter-of-fact. "A good one. Career, apartment, the whole thing. I worked in finance, made more money than I needed honestly, and I was—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I was arrogant about it. Thought I'd earned every bit of it through pure merit, you know? Didn't see how much luck and privilege went into getting me there." She listened, utterly still. There was someone in my life, someone who needed help, real help, and they asked me, directly. Not for money, though that would have been easy enough to give. They needed me to speak up about something, to use my position, my voice, to support them when they were being treated unfairly at work. "Ni?" He looked down at his hands. And I didn't. I told myself it wasn't my business, that I couldn't risk getting involved, that they were probably exaggerating anyway. All the usual justifications people make when helping someone would be inconvenient. The morning sounds continued around them. A bus hissing to a stop, someone's phone ringing, a dog barking. But his voice cut through it all with quiet precision. They lost their job, their reputation, fell into depression. Last I heard, they'd moved back in with family in another state, starting over from nothing, because I was too comfortable to risk my comfort for them. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. He shook his head. "Don't be sorry for me. I'm not the victim of that story. But I couldn't keep living that life after that. It felt like a lie, like I'd built everything on pretending not to see what was right in front of me. So I walked away from it. All of it. To do this?" She gestured vaguely at the alcove, the cardboard, the situation. "To learn to see," he corrected gently. "Being here, sitting in this spot every day, it forces me to see what I spent years training myself to ignore. The people who walk by without looking, the ones who cross the street to avoid me, the ones who look right through me like I'm not even here." He met her eyes again. "And it shows me the rare ones who stop, who see, who divide what they have instead of just giving from their excess. You've taught me more about generosity in 4 months than I learned in 40 years before this." She didn't know what to say. Her mind was reeling, trying to reconcile the man she'd imagined with the man actually sitting in front of her. "I never asked your name," he said. "Sarah," she said. Her voice came out smaller than intended. "Sarah." He nodded slowly, like he was committing it to memory. "I'm Michael." She smiled. A real smile this time, not the polite one she'd been wearing. "Hi, Michael." "Hi, Sarah." They stood there for another moment, something fundamental having shifted between them. She glanced at her phone. 8:17. She was definitely, absolutely late now. "I have to go," she said reluctantly. "I know, thank you. For today. For all the days." She started to turn away, then stopped. "Will you be here tomorrow?" He tilted his head slightly, considering. "Maybe, maybe not. But Sarah, tomorrow let me return the favor." She didn't understand what he meant, and she could see he wasn't going to explain. So she just nodded, adjusted her bag on her shoulder, and walked toward the subway. Behind her, Michael watched her go with an expression of deep thought. The rest of Sarah's day was predictably chaotic. She arrived at work at 8:47, nearly an hour late, to find her boss, Leonard, waiting by her desk with the exact expression of theatrical disappointment he wore whenever he wanted to make sure everyone in the office knew someone had screwed up. "Sarah, my office. Now." She'd followed him into the small, airless room that smelled of old coffee and desperation, and listened to a 10-minute lecture about reliability and professional standards, and setting an example, despite the fact that she'd been late exactly 3 times in 2 years. and Leonard himself regularly strolled in at 10 a.m. She'd apologized. She'd explained about the alarm. She'd promised it wouldn't happen again. "See that it doesn't," he'd said, already bored with his own power play. "Now, I need that Morrison report by lunch." The Morrison report, which had previously been due whenever you get to it, was now apparently urgent. She'd spent the next 4 hours frantically pulling together data, formatting spreadsheets, and writing summaries that no one would actually read, but everyone would complain about if they weren't perfectly formatted. At 12:30, while her co-workers headed out for lunch at the Thai place down the street, she ate her packed sandwich at her desk. Peanut butter and banana, the same thing she'd had yesterday and would probably have tomorrow, and stared at the gray cubicle wall in front of her. Michael's words kept echoing in her head. "You're not someone who has extra. You're someone who divides what you have." Ewa, was that true? She'd never thought about it that way. She'd always just thought of herself as someone who managed, who made do, who was fine, really, just fine. But when she really looked at it, the shoes that needed replacing but she kept resoling instead. The winter coat from 3 years ago that she'd patched on the inside where the lining was tearing. The haircut she did herself in her bathroom because $40 at a salon felt impossible to justify. The social invitations she declined because drinks after work or dinner out or a weekend trip to the beach all required a budget she didn't have. She wasn't poor. Not really. She had a roof over her head, food to eat, a job. She knew she was luckier than many, but she also wasn't comfortable. She existed in this strange liminal space where everything was just barely balanced, where one unexpected expense, a medical bill, a car repair if she'd owned a car, an emergency of any kind, could topple the whole carefully maintained structure. And out of that precarious balance, she'd been giving away $5 a day, $25 a week, about $100 a month. Over 4 months, that was. She did the math in her head. Roughly $400. $400 that could have been new shoes, or a small emergency fund, or just breathing room. But somehow, even knowing that, she couldn't regret it. The afternoon dragged on with its usual parade of meaningless tasks dressed up as important work. By 5:30, when she was finally allowed to leave, she felt wrung out and hollow. The subway ride home was crowded, hot, and loud. She stood pressed between a teenager with headphones leaking tinny music and a businessman whose cologne was aggressive enough to constitute assault. She closed her eyes and thought about the cool shower she'd take when she got home, the simple dinner she'd make, the quiet evening ahead. When she finally climbed the 4 flights to her studio apartment, she was surprised to find she was smiling slightly. Michael had said he'd return the favor tomorrow. She didn't know what that meant, but she found herself curious. After 4 months of routine, something had shifted. Something had changed. She didn't know how much. The next morning, Sarah's alarm went off at 6:30 as usual. She went through her routine, shower, dress, coffee, pack lunch. She left her building at 7:40, right on schedule. The morning was cooler than yesterday, pleasant. The city felt less hostile. When she reached the corner, she slowed her pace, looking toward the alcove. Michael wasn't there. The cardboard was gone. The spot was empty except for some old leaves and a coffee cup someone had discarded. Sarah stopped completely, feeling something unexpected twist in her chest. Disappointment? Worry? She couldn't name it exactly, but it felt like loss. She'd known this might happen. He'd said, maybe, when she asked if he'd be there. And he'd told her his story. That he wasn't permanently homeless, that this was some kind of chosen experience. Of course, he wouldn't be there forever, but 4 months of routine was powerful, and she'd let herself believe somewhere in the back of her mind that the routine would continue, that she'd see him there tomorrow and the next day and the day after that, that she wouldn't have to face the fact that her one meaningful daily interaction had been built on borrowed time. She stood there for a minute longer, commuters flowing around her with the usual urban choreography of avoidance. Then she continued to the subway. The day at work was standard. Leonard ignored her. Her co-workers chatted about a show she hadn't watched. She processed claims, answered emails, and ate her lunch alone in the break room. At 3:15, her desk phone rang. Sarah Mitchell? The voice was professional, female, unfamiliar. Speaking. This is Diane Chen from Harper & Associates. I'm calling regarding a position that's recently become available. Your name was recommended to us by someone who spoke very highly of your work ethic and attention to detail. Would you be interested in having a conversation about a senior administrative coordinator role? Sarah blinked at her computer screen, trying to process this. I'm sorry, who recommended me? Who? I'm not at liberty to say specifically, but I can tell you they were quite insistent that we reach out to you directly. The position comes with a significant increase in responsibility and compensation. Would you be available for a preliminary phone interview this week? Yes, Sarah heard herself say. Yes, definitely. They scheduled something for Friday morning. Diane provided some basic details about the company. A mid-size consulting firm, reputable, growing, and promised to send over more information by email. When Sarah hung up, her hands were shaking slightly. A recommended position. A significant increase in compensation. Someone who spoke highly of her work. But who? She'd kept to herself at work. She wasn't close with any of her co-workers. She didn't network. She just did her job and went home. Unless, no, that was impossible, wasn't it? The rest of the week passed in a strange blur of anticipation and confusion. The phone interview on Friday went well. Better than well. Diane had been warm and enthusiastic, and the position sounded like everything Sarah's current job wasn't. Respected, valued, with actual opportunities for growth. The salary they mentioned was 40% more than what she currently made. 40%. That was the difference between dividing and having extra. That was new shoes when needed. Lunches out sometimes. Maybe even saving for something bigger. They wanted her to come in for an in-person interview the following Tuesday. Sarah agreed, trying to keep the desperation out of her voice. On Saturday morning, she walked to the corner out of habit, even though it was her day off and she had no reason to go that direction. Michael's spot remained empty. A different person had claimed it. Younger, more agitated, calling out to passers-by with aggressive energy that made people walk faster. She thought about stopping, offering something. But it felt wrong somehow, like she'd be betraying something, though she couldn't say what. On Sunday, she did laundry in her building's basement, organized her tiny closet, and tried on the one professional blazer she owned to see if it still looked appropriate for a serious interview. It did, mostly, if she wore it with the right shirt to hide where the lining was worn at the elbows. On Monday, she went back to work. Leonard was in rare form, criticizing a report she'd spent hours on because the margins were inconsistent. They weren't. She smiled, nodded, and fixed the non-existent problem. Tuesday morning arrived with crystalline clarity. She woke up early, took extra time getting ready, wore her best outfit, the one she saved for the rare occasions that required looking like she belonged somewhere better than where she was. She left her building at 7:15 to give herself plenty of time to get to the Harper & Associates office. She walked her usual route, even though it wasn't the most direct path to where she was going. When she reached the corner, she paused. Still empty. She felt foolish for hoping. Then she noticed something. Tucked into a crack in the jewelry store's security gate, where someone would only see it if they were really looking, was a small envelope. Her name was written on it, in careful handwriting. Sarah. Her heart began to pound. She pulled it free, looked around as if expecting Michael to appear. But the sidewalk was just the usual morning rush of strangers. She opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded neatly. The handwriting was the same, precise, educated, deliberate. Sarah. You helped me when nobody was watching, when you had every reason not to. You saw me when I'd made myself invisible, to learn a lesson I needed to learn. I spent years in a career where I had influence I didn't use for good. I had connections I didn't leverage to help people who deserved help. I had resources I hoarded instead of sharing. I've spent the last 6 months trying to understand what real generosity looks like. You showed me. Not with grand gestures or surplus wealth, but with consistent small choices that cost you something real. I've recently reconnected with my old professional network, not to return to that life, but to use what I built there for something better. I made some calls, spoke to people who owe me favors, told them about someone extraordinary who they needed to meet. I didn't exaggerate. Everything I said about you was true. Your reliability, your integrity, your attention to detail. I've watched you for months, and I know the kind of person you are. You might not think I know these things from our brief interactions, but poverty, even chosen poverty, teaches you to see what people usually miss. You see who checks their phone while stepping over someone in need, who makes eye contact and who doesn't, who gives from their surplus, and who divides what they have. You divided what you had, every single day. That says everything about who you are. Harper and Associates is a good company. The people there are decent. They'll value you in ways your current employer doesn't. The salary is real. The opportunity is real. You gave me something I didn't deserve. Kindness without judgment. Consistency without fanfare. Now let me give you something you do deserve. A chance to be seen the way you saw me. Don't worry about seeing me again. My lesson here is finished. I'm moving forward. To what, I'm still figuring out. But I'm taking what you taught me with me. The world needs to see you, Sarah. Stop hiding your light behind resignation to a small life. You're capable of so much more than you've let yourself believe. Thank you for every morning, for every $5, for every moment of recognition. Some stories don't end with reunions. They end with transformations. Go to that interview, shine like I know you can. And next time you have $5 to spare, give it to yourself first. You've earned that. With genuine gratitude, Michael. Sarah read it twice, then 3 times. By the 4th time, tears were streaming down her face, and she was sitting on the curb, not caring about her interview clothes or the time or the people walking past, wondering what was wrong with this woman crying on the sidewalk at 7:30 in the morning. Someone had seen her, really seen her, and thought she deserved more. When had anyone last thought that about her? She folded the letter carefully, put it back in the envelope, and tucked it into her bag next to her wallet, the thin one with 2 credit cards and a single $5 bill. Then she stood up, straightened her blazer, wiped her face, and walked toward the subway with her head a little higher than before. She had an interview to ace, and for the first time in a long time, she believed she actually would. The Harper and Associates office was everything her current workplace wasn't. Natural light flooded through large windows. The furniture looked comfortable and intentional rather than cheaply functional. People moved through the hallways with purpose, but not panic. The air smelled like good coffee and plants. Actual plants, not the sad plastic ones in her current break room. Sarah sat in the reception area, hands folded in her lap to keep them from shaking, and tried to project calm confidence. Diane Chen appeared at exactly 10 a.m. Punctual, professional, warm. Sarah? Perfect. Come on back. The interview lasted 90 minutes. It should have been terrifying. Instead, it felt like the first real conversation about work Sarah had had in years. Diane asked substantive questions about how Sarah handled complex scheduling conflicts, how she prioritized competing demands, how she dealt with difficult personalities. Not the usual scripted interview questions, but real scenarios that required real thinking. And Sarah found herself answering honestly, not trying to perform or pretend, but actually explaining her methods, her reasoning, her approaches to problems. She talked about the system she'd built for herself to stay organized when her boss was chaotic, about the way she'd learned to anticipate needs before they became emergencies, about the careful diplomacy required to navigate office politics without getting drawn into drama. Diane nodded along, occasionally jotting notes, asking follow-up questions that showed she was really listening. "You know," Diane said at one point, "the person who recommended you said you were someone who saw what others missed and fixed it before it became a problem. That's exactly what we need here. Our executives are brilliant but scattered. They need someone who can think 3 steps ahead." Sarah felt a surge of gratitude toward Michael so intense it was almost physical. After the interview, Diane walked her back to reception. "I want to be transparent with you," Diane said. We have a couple of other candidates we're meeting with, but honestly, you're the front runner. Expect to hear from us by end of week. And Sarah, you should know that whoever recommended you, they vouched for you in the strongest possible terms. Said you were the most genuinely reliable person they'd ever worked with. That kind of recommendation matters here. Sarah left the building feeling lighter than she had in months, maybe years. On the subway ride home, she pulled out Michael's letter and read it again. The world needs to see you, Sarah. Maybe it did. Maybe it was time to let it. Friday afternoon, Sarah's desk phone rang at 4:37 p.m. Ms. Mitchell, this is Diane Chen from Harper & Associates. Do you have a moment? Sarah's heart began hammering. Yes, of course. I'm pleased to offer you the position of Senior Administrative Coordinator. We'll be sending over the formal offer letter this evening. But I wanted to call personally. We're all very excited about having you join the team. The salary Diane named was even higher than initially mentioned. The benefits were comprehensive. The start date was flexible to allow for proper notice at her current job. Sarah accepted before her brain fully caught up with her mouth. When she hung up, she sat very still at her desk for a long moment. Then she opened her bottom drawer, pulled out her worn canvas bag, and found Michael's letter where she'd been keeping it. You're capable of so much more than you've let yourself believe. She was about to find out if that was true. 2 weeks later, Sarah walked into Harper & Associates on her first official day. The onboarding was thorough but not overwhelming. Her new boss, James, was everything Leonard wasn't: organized, respectful, genuinely interested in her input. Her desk had a window view. Her computer was new. Her responsibilities were clearly defined. By the end of the first week, she knew she'd made the right choice. The work was challenging, but not impossible. The people were professional, but not cold. She felt valued in a way she'd forgotten was possible. Her first paycheck, prorated for 3 weeks, was more than she'd made in a month at her old job. She sat in her studio apartment that evening, looking at the direct deposit notification, and felt something shift inside her. Not happiness exactly, but possibility. The sense that maybe, just maybe, she could stop dividing and start building. The following Monday morning, she left her apartment at 7:40 out of habit. She walked her usual route, even though it was no longer on her way to work. When she reached the corner, Michael's corner, she stopped. The spot was occupied by a woman today, middle-aged, with tired eyes and a cardboard sign that read, "Anything helps." Sarah reached into her bag. Her wallet was different now, slightly thicker, with room to breathe. But she still kept some bills separate, easy to reach. She pulled out a $20 bill. The woman's eyes widened. "Are you sure?" she asked quietly. Sarah smiled. "I'm sure. Have a good day." As she continued toward the subway, she felt Michael's presence somehow, not literally, but as a lesson carried forward. A gesture witnessed becoming a gesture passed on. That evening, she sat at her small desk, the boards and bricks set up she'd built herself, and pulled out paper and a pen. She wrote a letter, not to Michael. She had no address, no way to reach him, but to herself. A letter to read on the days when she forgot what had changed, when she started to doubt, when the old patterns of resignation and making do threatened to resurface. She wrote about being seen, about the difference between charity and recognition, about how sometimes the smallest choices create the largest ripples. She wrote about dividing what you have versus giving from your surplus. She wrote about believing you deserve more. When she finished, she folded it carefully and put it in an envelope. Wrote, "For when you forget," on the outside. Tucked it into the back of her desk drawer. Then she made herself dinner. Not the cheapest option, but what she actually wanted. She ran a bath instead of a quick shower. She called her sister and told her about the new job. "I'm so proud of you," her sister said, voice warm. "I knew you were capable of more than that place was giving you." After they hung up, Sarah sat in the quiet of her apartment and thought about visibility. How strange it was that you could exist in full view of thousands of people and still be invisible. How you could work hard, show up every day, do everything right, and still be overlooked simply because no one was really looking. But when someone finally saw you, really saw you, everything could change. She'd seen Michael when others didn't. He'd seen her when others didn't. And that mutual recognition had transformed both their stories. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the conference room at Harper & Associates, presenting the new organizational system she'd developed for coordinating between departments. The executives listened attentively. James nodded along. When she finished, the CFO, a sharp woman named Patricia, smiled. "This is excellent work, Sarah. Exactly the kind of proactive thinking we need. I'd like you to present this to the senior partners next week." Sarah agreed, trying to keep the pride off her face. After the meeting, James caught up with her in the hallway. "You know, when we first hired you, we thought we were getting a good administrator. Turns out, we got someone who actually improves how we function. Have you thought about a management track?" She had, but she'd been afraid to seem presumptuous. "I'd be interested in exploring that," she said carefully. "Good. Let's talk about it in your 6-month review, which is next week, by the way. Spoiler alert. You're exceeding expectations." Sarah walked back to her desk with a lightness in her step she still wasn't quite used to. Her apartment was different now, too. She'd moved to a 1-bedroom in a better building. Not fancy, but with water pressure that actually worked and windows that looked out at trees instead of an air shaft. She had furniture beyond boards and bricks. She'd gone to a real salon for a haircut, small changes, but they added up to a life that felt less like survival and more like living. She still saw the woman at the corner sometimes, a different person now, a younger man, and she still stopped. But now the money came from different category in her mental budget. Not dividing what I have, but giving from what I can spare. The difference mattered. One Saturday morning in autumn, Sarah was walking through a neighborhood she'd never explored before. She could afford to take the train places now just to wander, when she passed a small coffee shop with outdoor seating. A man sat at one of the tables reading a newspaper. She stopped walking. He looked different, clean-shaven, hair trimmed, wearing clothes that fit properly. But the profile was unmistakable. Michael. Her heart began to race. Should she approach? Say something? What would she even say? Before she could decide, he looked up. Their eyes met. His face broke into a smile. Genuine, warm, with no trace of the careful neutrality he'd worn on that corner. "Sarah," he said, standing. "I wondered if I'd run into you eventually." "Michael." She walked over, feeling oddly shy. "You look different." "So do you," he said. "Different good. You took the job." "I did, thank you. For whatever you said, whatever you did." He waved a hand. "I just made an introduction, you did the rest. Are you happy?" She considered the question. "Getting there. Better than I was. And you?" He gestured to the empty chair. "Do you have time?" She did. They sat. He ordered them both coffee. Good coffee. The kind she was still getting used to being able to afford without guilt. Michael told her his story. How his time on the street had been part of a larger reckoning with who he'd been and who he wanted to become. How he'd reconnected with his old firm not to go back, but to facilitate a transition. How he'd taken what remained of his savings and invested in a nonprofit that helped people bridge the gap between homelessness and employment. "I use what I learned," he said, about what it feels like to be invisible, about what real help looks like versus performative charity, about meeting people where they are instead of where you think they should be. "That's incredible," Sarah said, and meant it. "You inspired it," he said simply. "You and the others, the few others, who actually stopped, who actually saw. I watched hundreds of people walk past me every day. Wealthy people, middle-class people, people who probably had even less than you. Most of them never even glanced at me. But you stopped, consistently, without making it about yourself or your virtue, just recognizing another human." They talked for an hour, about their work, their lives, the strange way their paths had crossed and changed each other. Finally, Sarah glanced at her watch. "I should go. I'm meeting my sister and her kids for lunch." "That sounds nice." Michael stood with her. "Sarah, I'm glad we ran into each other. I've thought about you often, wondered how things turned out." "Better than I expected," she admitted. "Thanks to you." "Thanks to you first," he countered. Kindness compounds. You showed me some. I passed it along. Now you're thriving and probably showing kindness to others. That's how it's supposed to work. They exchanged actual contact information this time. Phone numbers, email addresses, the infrastructure of a potential real friendship. As she walked away, Sarah turned back once. Michael had sat down again, was returning to his newspaper, looking like any other person enjoying a Saturday morning at a cafe. Visible, valued, seen, just like she was now. That night, Sarah pulled out the letter she'd written to herself 6 months ago. For when you forget. She didn't need it anymore. She hadn't forgotten. But she read it anyway, remembering who she'd been, the person who divided what she had, who believed she deserved nothing more than survival, who thought her small gestures didn't matter. She thought about Michael's words. Kindness compounds. He was right. Her morning gesture hadn't just helped someone in need. It had created a ripple that came back to her, transformed her life, and would continue outward from here to touch others. She thought about the young man she'd given money to last week, about the coworker she'd helped with a project without being asked, about the smile she'd given the barista who looked exhausted. Small gestures, easily invisible, but compounding. She folded the letter and put it back in its drawer. Then she opened her laptop and pulled up a document she'd been working on. A proposal for a mentorship program at Harper & Associates that would partner with Michael's nonprofit. The kind of program she wished had existed for her. The kind of thing she could create now, that she had a voice that was heard. She worked late into the night, building something new from the foundation of kindness she'd once received. Outside her window, the city glowed with thousands of lit windows. Thousands of lives, intersecting and separate, visible and unseen. In one of those windows, Michael was probably working too, building his own bridge between having nothing and having everything. In another, someone was struggling, dividing what they had, trying to hold on. In another, someone was being seen for the first time. And tomorrow morning, all of them would step out into the same city, walk past each other, make choices about whether to see or be seen, to give or withhold, to recognize or ignore. Sarah saved her document and closed her laptop. She knew which choices she would keep making, the same ones she'd always made. Only now she was no longer dividing what she had. She was giving from what she'd become, and that made all the difference. If you liked this story, leave a like and subscribe for more.